Beneath the sunlit courtyards of Rome and the whispering orchids of a New York brownstone, secrets slept for decades until memory, forged letters, and a gold watch stirred them awake. What compels a man to vanish behind a false name? And what price is paid when silence becomes survival? In this mystery, guilt is not always buried with the dead, and some betrayals echo louder than justice. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. Wolfe gave no name, no description, no context, just a time, a flight number, and the instruction to bring the guest directly to the brownstone, without delay, deviation, or commentary. That last part was for me. LaGuardia wasn't any more charming in May than in February, but I stood at the terminal like a man trying to find his reflection in a broken mirror. The passengers came off the plane, 2 businessmen, a mother with a screeching toddler, 3 Italians in rumpled linen, and a woman in red who clearly wasn't here for detection. No one looked expectant. No one looked like they had an appointment with Nero Wolfe. I waited 20 minutes, circled the terminal, and even asked a stewardess, who replied with the kind of look that suggested she'd fielded one too many fools for the day. By the time I flagged a cab back to West 35th Street, the only thing I'd collected was jet fuel in my nostrils and a vague sense that Wolfe had sent me on an errand he didn't expect to be fulfilled. Back at the brownstone, things weren't just quiet. They were deliberate. Which, with Wolfe, is always more troubling than noise. The first thing I saw when I walked in was Fritz, standing like a statue with a towel over his forearm, his expression halfway between a butler and a bishop at a funeral. "You have a message," he said, not moving. I glanced at the silver tray he held out, and there it was. An envelope that looked like it had crossed 2 oceans and 3 layers of official bureaucracy. Tan paper, edges crumpled, corners torn just enough to show its urgency had not been handled gently. I took it. The postmark read Roma. The typeface inside was stiff and uneven, like someone had dictated it in a whisper, and the machine had strained to listen. "Find Arthur Cray. Urgent. Confidential. Only Wolfe." "Contessa Biancasordi?" I read it twice. Then a third time for the rhythm. Then again because that name, Contessa Biancasordi, did not land like a stranger. Fritz watched me, polite as always. "He's upstairs," he said, in a tone that implied Wolfe had already read the message, memorized it, and had formed at least 5 opinions. I climbed the stairs slowly, telegram in hand. Wolfe didn't often get mail from Rome, and certainly not from anyone who signed their name, as if the world already knew the backstory. But that's the trick with old debts and foreign nobility. Sometimes the past writes in all caps. When I stepped into the office, Wolfe was standing, yes, standing, at the globe in the corner, one hand on the brass meridian, as if Rome might tilt toward him if he stared hard enough. I offered the telegram. He didn't reach for it. He didn't have to. "I've read it," he said. Then, without another syllable, he turned, walked past me, and vanished into the hallway, heading for the plant rooms with the slow, deliberate grace of a man retreating to the only place where nothing breathes unless he lets it. No questions, no commands, no commentary. For Wolfe, silence is never absence, it's pressure. And right now it was enough to fog glass. I watched the hallway for a long minute, wondering if orchids had any recorded opinions on butlers. I found Fritz in the kitchen arranging a silver tea service like a surgeon preparing scalpels. I slid onto a stool at the counter and said, "Tell me what you know about Italian nobility with a taste for telegrams." Fritz looked up, polite but firm. Mr. Wolfe said nothing, but he looked at the name for a very long time. Then he said he needed beer, and went to the orchids. "That's not a recipe, Fritz." He poured boiling water over a dark, aromatic blend I couldn't pronounce, and handed me a cup. "It's not my place." Which meant he knew more than he was saying, and possibly less than he suspected. Fritz had mastered the art of neutrality, which in this house was survival. I took a sip and let the quiet pile up. If Wolfe had history with this Contessa, it hadn't been printed in the Times. And if she was pulling strings from Rome, I had the uneasy sense one of those strings had already looped around our little brownstone. It wasn't the first time a woman's name had made Wolfe unsteady. But it might be the first time he walked away from it without even sitting down. I figured if Wolfe wasn't going to talk, I might as well do what he hired me for. Dig where people would rather I didn't. A few calls to some old contacts at the domestic staffing agencies turned up a match. Arthur Cray, English by birth, entered the city's service circuit sometime in the early 40s. He had letters of recommendation from a banker on Park Avenue and a diplomat's widow in Connecticut. All glowing, all vague. Then he landed with the Kendalls. That's Leland and Margot Kendall, whose Fifth Avenue townhouse had more silverware than the Vatican and half the morals. Cray served them for almost 5 years, then disappeared without fanfare. No resignation, no forwarding address, just one day gone. I tried calling the Kendalls, but Leland was on his third martini and Margot was at a spa in Sedona. I left a message with a secretary who didn't seem to believe butlers existed anymore. Still, it fit. The kind of man who never raised his voice, left rooms cleaner than he found them, and vanished like steam off hot silver. Rome, I figured, was either the perfect hiding place, or the one place a man like that could finally stop pretending he didn't have secrets of his own. When I returned to the office and gave Wolfe the short version of Cray's resume, he was seated behind his desk, the globe untouched, and a fresh bottle of Remmers in front of him. "Interesting," he murmured, which was Wolfe-speak for irrelevant but filed. "So what's the play?" I asked. "Do we call the Contessa? Ask her to FedEx a motive?" He shook his head, slowly. "Number we do nothing. I do nothing. Rome is a beautiful city, but unpardonably inconvenient. I do not travel, Archie, not for women, not for ghosts, and not for missing men who carried other men's coats." I leaned on the edge of the desk. "She said only Wolfe. That doesn't strike you as bait?" "It strikes me as accurate," he said, "but not binding." Which meant the case was closed, unless, of course, it decided to open itself. It was the next morning, just as Fritz set down Wolfe's breakfast, scrambled eggs, beer, and a roll that had no right being that precise, when the doorbell rang. I was halfway through pouring the coffee when I heard it. Not just the chime, but Fritz's change in posture. He turned toward the door like a man who'd just been addressed in Latin. I opened it. She stood there, veiled and composed, dressed in navy blue with gloves the color of cold cream. A travel hat with a netted brim tilted just so. If you'd told me she'd stepped out of a frame in the Uffizi and stopped at customs, I wouldn't have argued. "I am Contessa Biancasordi," she said, voice silked with tobacco and memory. "Is Mr. Wolfe receiving?" It wasn't a question, and it wasn't hope. It was declaration, and it had history behind it. I glanced over my shoulder. From upstairs, Wolfe's voice arrived, unhurried and absolute. "No!" The silence that followed was as sharp as any verdict. The Contessa didn't flinch. She looked past me, at the house, the hallway, the smell of eggs and orchids, and smiled. "I'll wait," she said. So she did, and I did. And somewhere upstairs, Wolfe added another brick to the wall he'd just started building. It's a fact I've learned to live with, that Nero Wolfe never answers his own door. But when I opened it that morning, I almost wished he had, just for the show. She stood there like a line from a forgotten poem, tall, composed, draped in navy wool with a silver clasp at her collar and gloved hands that hadn't touched anything impolite in years. A faint scent, floral, faintly smoky, expensive, drifted from her like an inherited secret. Her accent was the kind you didn't imitate unless you wanted to be sued by Florence. "I am Contessa Biancasordi," she said, as if she were reciting her passport to a man who'd lost the right to ask for it. "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe." I stepped aside and led her to the front room. Fritz materialized almost instantly, eyes flicking once across the folds of her coat, and then hovering behind her, like he thought she might ask for tea in Latin. I gave her the Wolfe waiting routine. No promises, no clocks, and told Fritz to inform him she was here. He didn't answer, which, in this house, often meant the volcano was warming under the orchids. She didn't bother with small talk, which I appreciated. The Contessa settled into the armchair like it had been built for her ancestry and turned those storm-colored eyes on me like I might have something worth hiding. "Arthur Cray," she began, with the softness of someone naming the dead. "He was in my husband's employ for 3 years. Quiet, punctual, unfailingly discreet, a man who understood his station and never presumed to exceed it." I nodded, trying to look like I hadn't already pulled his records from 2 agencies and a footman's registry in Manhattan. She went on, smoothing a glove she hadn't removed. 2 weeks ago, he was gone. No explanation, no luggage taken. The household was untouched. But something had shifted, as if the air itself had misplaced a presence. I raised an eyebrow. No note? No conversation? No one saw him leave? "Of course they did," she said sharply. "They say they didn't, which is not the same thing." She paused, as if weighing how much of herself to put into the room. "My husband died 6 months ago. Since then, tensions. Old servants maneuvering, secrets untied. And Arthur, he was too careful. That is what makes his disappearance more ominous than simple flight." I nodded again, not for agreement, but encouragement. This was no domestic hiccup. She wasn't just here to retrieve a runaway servant. And Wolfe, up there with the orchids, knew it too, whether or not he chose to admit it. The Contessa's gaze dropped for the first time, not to gather herself, but to slice the next piece with precision. "My husband," she said slowly, "was a man with a long past. Not all of it noble. I let that one sit. In the villa's archives," she continued, "there were letters, sealed, some from the war, some addressed to names no longer spoken in polite company. I never read them, but I believe Arthur did. That got a blink out of me. You think he stole them? I think he read them, and someone knew that he had." Her voice never rose, but her fingers, still gloved, curled tight on the armrest. "The police believe he took the letters and ran, that he means to sell them. I do not. Arthur Cray was not the kind of man who runs. He would have told me." "That's a lot of faith in a butler," I said, not unkindly. She met my eyes. "I knew him better than my husband did." The air tightened, and for a moment it wasn't just a mystery we were circling. It was something older, something more personal than she wanted to name. And from the corner of the hallway I thought I heard the faintest sound, Wolfe clearing his throat. Which, in that house, meant he'd already decided something, whether we liked it or not. It's one of Wolfe's cardinal rules that guests, especially those bearing accents and ancestry, do not summon him. So when he entered the room without being asked, without so much as a bell or a glare, I knew something had shifted behind the curtain. The Contessa rose, slowly, like a dancer remembering the steps, and inclined her head. "Nero," she said. "You haven't changed, except the eyes. Those are heavier." He stopped 2 feet from her and regarded her the way he might an orchid gone slightly brittle around the edges. "You mistake me, madam," he said. "We've never met." A pause, the kind meant to make men fidget. She didn't. "Vienna, January of 39. The table at Sacher's. You had pheasant with blackcurrant sauce. You said the waiter had a criminal soul." He inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying. "Then it must have been someone else," he said, "or a forgery." She smiled, not warmly, but with memory. "Even your lies are symmetrical." He didn't smile back. Wolfe didn't like nostalgia. It wasn't that he had none. He simply refused to lease space to it. I stayed still, waiting for the part where time cracked open and told the truth. Wolfe had done a lot of things in front of me: dictation, denunciation, digestion, but I had rarely seen him put on a mask that well. He stood there as if the woman weren't pressing her past into the room like a thumbprint into butter. I watched his mouth, the angle of his shoulders, the way his left hand curled slightly. Not with tension, but calculation. He knew her, that was certain. The question wasn't whether, it was how much he wanted her to think he didn't. The Contessa, for her part, played the game like a maestro. No offense, no pleading, just the faint suggestion of something once shared and not forgotten. I didn't trust her. But I didn't trust Wolfe either. Not when he went that still. It wasn't just her presence that worried me. It was his silence, which, with Wolfe, always came at a cost. The Contessa turned toward Wolfe, her voice smoothing to its lower register, the one women use when they know the room already leans their way. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I have not come to enlist a detective. I've come to beg a mind." Wolfe grunted, not from insult, but from the predictability of it. "I cannot involve the Italian police," she continued. "The implications are too delicate. There are reputations, old alliances, and the dead do not speak for themselves, but their letters sometimes do." Wolfe folded his hands across his stomach, which was a subtle signal that the proposition had entered the vestibule but not yet been invited to sit. "I understand," she said, "that you do not travel. I was told as much, but I had to ask." "You had to dramatize," Wolfe corrected. "You've done so with care and varnish, but the answer remains. Rome is an exquisite city, and I've enjoyed it, vicariously, through Livy and wine. But physically, I have no intention of enduring customs, cathedrals, or hotel sheets." Her lips curved. "Even for truth?" "For truth," he said, "I have books." And then he closed his eyes, which, I knew, meant he had begun thinking seriously. She looked at him, not disappointed, not pleading, just weighing him, the way a sommelier sizes up a diner who orders water with duck. Then she said very softly, "Villa Farnese." I'd heard the name before, somewhere in one of those art books Wolfe pretends are for research, but I'd never seen it land like that. Wolfe's eyelids snapped open, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, his pupils did something unusual. They narrowed and steadied, as if adjusting for distance not of space, but of memory. The silence that followed was different, not rhetorical, not staged. He leaned back an inch. "Villa Farnese?" "Yes." He closed his eyes again, but this time only briefly. "In Viterbo?" "In the hills just west. It belonged to my husband's family. Now it belongs to me, though lately it feels more like it belongs to someone I can't see." Wolfe didn't reply. But I saw the shift. He wasn't weighing her anymore. He was weighing himself. And for Wolfe, that was rarer than agreement. After the Contessa left, with the kind of poise that suggests she never doubts a door will open again, I found Wolfe in the dining room, pouring himself 3 fingers of beer, not his usual midday quantity. He said, "Pack." I stared. "For what? A retreat into regret?" He turned, eyes flat. "Rome." I said something unprintable and went to get my suitcase. There are things a man argues, and there are things he follows, like Wolfe's voice when it comes out of stillness. It was the way he said it that mattered, as if the past had finally sent for him, and this time he meant to answer. The Roman air smelled like old stone and fresh contempt. We stepped off the platform into a warmth that clung to your collar, and there stood Captain Orsi, square shoulders, pinched mouth, and the eyes of a man who'd been ordered to collect a toothache in human form. "Signori Wolfe, Goodwin." He didn't offer a hand, just a half bow that suggested somebody at the consulate owed him a favor he meant to collect later. Wolfe acknowledged him with a nod that cost him nothing. "Captain." I tipped my hat, since one of us had to pretend we were glad to be here. The ride from Termini was a polite competition of silence. Orsi's glances in the rear view weren't hostile, just surgical. I could tell he'd sized us up before we'd left the station and hadn't liked the fit. Wolfe closed his eyes, not asleep, thinking, probably remapping the Roman Empire or weighing whether lunch would be edible. Orsi exhaled like a man trying to stay civil for diplomatic reasons. "I trust," he said, "you did not come to interfere." Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "Interference implies movement. I assure you, Captain, I shall remain perfectly still." We hadn't cleared the first piazza before Orsi began to unpack his theory like a man forced to recite a speech he didn't entirely believe. "Arthur Cray," he said, "was in possession of letters. Sensitive letters. Relics of your Contessa's late husband's wartime affiliations." Wolfe said nothing, but I tilted my head to show I was at least pretending to care. "Letters," Orsi continued, "which he may have used to, negotiate his security, perhaps even blackmail." "So Cray skipped town?" I asked. "Or was helped to vanish?" Orsi said flatly. "It happens." He didn't look at Wolfe when he said it, which told me he was saving his sharper jabs for later. I leaned back, watching the ochre walls blur past. "And you brought us here to confirm your theory?" "I did not bring you," Orsi said. "You arrived." Wolfe opened one eye. An important distinction, let us both remember it. The Contessa's villa sat on a shaded stretch of Via Julia, dignified, discreet, and just damp enough to remind you that Rome was old long before Wolfe's digestion turned medieval. I went alone. Wolfe had declared, over wine and logic, that his presence would serve no purpose and that his shoes were not designed for cobblestones. The housekeeper, Elena, met me with a smile that had been trained to survive scandal. She was young, Roman, and clearly aware of her effect. Her vowels curved, her posture was deliberate. When I asked about Cray, she leaned in slightly as if secrets should be shared in perfume. "He was very proper," she said. "Too proper, not Italian." The gardener, Niccolo, was older, sun-creased, and preferred plants to people. When I mentioned the name Cray, he paused over a rose bush and muttered something about masks. "Men who know too much," he said, "often choose the wrong time to know it." Last was the chef, who was either stone-deaf or theatrically so. He signed that Cray had vanished during a thunderstorm, poof, and looked at the ceiling like it owed him a better story. No one had seen anything. But all of them were certain they'd felt something when he went, as if the air had changed temperature. Back at the hotel, I wrote it down just like that. Wolfe doesn't like metaphors, but sometimes that's all you get. The hotel was grand in the way Roman hotels are, which is to say, nothing worked properly, but the service was exquisite. Wolfe commandeered the suite like Caesar crossing the Rubicon and declared it his command post. The bellboy was instructed to fetch English newspapers, Italian wine, and a telephone line strong enough for diplomatic subterfuge. By the time I returned from the villa, Wolfe was settled in the armchair by the window, surrounded by clippings, notes, and a bottle of Barbera that he was nursing with the kind of affection most men reserve for childhood dogs. "You were gone 3 hours," he said, without looking up. "That suggests either incompetence or conversation." "Plenty of the latter," I said, tossing my notebook on the table. "The help at the villa talks in riddles. One says he vanished. One says he wore a mask. One says he turned into fog." Wolfe grunted. "Italy has always preferred drama to data." I glanced at the window. "You haven't looked out once." "I'm not here for scenery." "No," I said, sitting. "You're here for ghosts." He didn't argue, which meant I was getting warm. I gave him the distilled version of my villa expedition, the chef with thunder, the gardener with fables, and Elena with everything except a motive. Wolfe, who had shifted only once in the past hour to reach for the wine, didn't move again. His eyes remained fixed on a clipping in his hand. "Did any of them lie?" he asked. "None of them confessed to it," I said. "But all 3 polished their answers." He nodded. That's the peril of unpaid liars. Professionals understand stakes. Amateurs just enjoy the sound of their own invention. He set the clipping down. It was not an impulsive departure. It was orchestrated. I raised an eyebrow. By whom? That, he said, is what remains hidden. But not, I think, for long. The way he said it gave me the feeling he already had a theory. But with Wolfe, the theory was always the last thing you were allowed to hear. Captain Orsi returned to the hotel just as Wolfe was buttering his third roll, which meant we had to hear the news over crumbs and contempt. A body, Orsi said, in the river, Tiber. Wolfe didn't look up. One presumes male, adult, and dead. Orsi ignored the jab. Luca Rinaldi, archivist, Vatican Library, pulled from the water last night. Witnesses say he was drinking. Was he? Wolfe asked. Orsi shifted. Possibly. He drowned. In what? Wolfe asked. Shame? Debt? Conscience? Orsi's jaw tightened. He was last seen 2 days ago having lunch with Arthur Cray. That landed. Even Wolfe stopped buttering. Then he is no longer merely missing, Wolfe said. He is a ghost in company. Orsi gave a nod, as if passing a baton. Your case now intersects with mine. Wolfe wiped his fingers delicately. It always did. You simply weren't looking in the right mirror. That earned Orsi's patented exit. Stiff, economical, and without promise of return. When the door closed, Wolfe remained still. Then, very softly, he said, Rinaldi. He said it not as a question, but like he was testing the taste of a bitter fruit. Dead men do not float alone, he murmured, and turned the clipping in his hand, face down. I didn't speak. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew we had just crossed a line Wolfe never marked on the floor, the moment when silence becomes implication. He picked up the telephone and dialed. Whatever came next, it would not be metaphor. By the time I hit my third Roman espresso, my blood was half caffeine and half contempt for Italian pastries. The croissant looked like it had been made during the Renaissance and left to age with the basilicas. But the news that accompanied it was fresh and far more unsettling. Luca Rinaldi, the archivist fished out of the Tiber, hadn't just been filing old prayers. According to a contact with a flair for indiscretion and a knack for whispering over sources, Rinaldi had clearance to the Vatican's restricted stacks, the kind of clearance that came with its own keys and consequences. More than that, he had a reputation. Not loud, not documented, but the kind that circulates in quiet corridors, a man who didn't mind trading knowledge for comfort or history for hush money. The whisper was that Rinaldi sold information, carefully, selectively, and always to the highest bidder with the cleanest gloves, that made two men, Rinaldi and Cray, both connected to things better left in drawers and boxes. As I paid the check and stepped out into the Roman sun, I realized we weren't hunting a missing butler anymore. We were sniffing along the trail of a man who'd touched something he shouldn't have, and died for the privilege. Getting into a Vatican library is one thing, getting into a Roman bank vault is another, but I've been told I can be persuasive when espresso and insinuation meet the right accent. With a gentle nudge from Wolfe and a more direct one from our contact at the British consulate, I got what we needed, confirmation that Luca Rinaldi shared access to a private safety deposit box at Banca Federale, the kind of place where people store things they wouldn't leave in a will. The other name on the box, Arthur Cray, or as the official document phrased it, Cray Arthur H., British subject Florence residence, verified by passport. It was all properly stamped and recorded, which meant someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make the fiction airtight. I requested, formally this time, access for our investigation. The clerk gave me a look that suggested my suit was not local, and my intentions were even less so. I gave him Wolfe's business card. That worked better than any badge. He promised to consult the legal office. I promised to wait. Back at the suite, I told Wolfe what I'd found. He said only, "At last," and turned a page in his clipping file. There's a sound Wolfe makes. Not quite satisfaction, not quite foreboding. When the net tightens just enough, he made it then. When I gave Wolfe the details, the names, the bank, the matching credentials, he didn't blink. He just lifted his glass of Barbara, took a slow, thoughtful sip, and raised one eyebrow with the elegance of a man approving a move in chess he'd anticipated 4 plays ago. "It is essential," he said, which in Wolfe's vocabulary might as well have been a war declaration. He made 2 calls. The first was to a minor British diplomat who owed him a debt of grammar. The second to the bank's director, whose name Wolfe pronounced with surgical accuracy. Both conversations were conducted with Wolfe's usual brevity, no threats, no poetry, just facts, formed with the economy of a man who never wastes syllables or breath. When he hung up, he said, "They will unlock it tomorrow at 10. I will not attend. You will." "Of course," I said. "And if there's a bomb?" "Be punctual," Wolfe replied. "And wear a tie." The box was brass, heavy, and surprisingly unadorned. When the clerk handed me the contents, I knew immediately we weren't dealing with stock certificates or family heirlooms. The folder inside was old but not ancient. Worn edges, ribbon tie, the sort of paper that absorbs sweat, secrets, and ink in equal measure. Back at the suite, I laid the contents out on Wolfe's desk while he looked on, impassive. One by one, I unfolded letters. Handwritten, typed, some in shaky diplomatic English, others in clipped bureaucratese. They all had one thing in common. They painted the Contessa's late husband, and by proximity the Contessa herself, as collaborators with occupying forces during the war. Names were named, dates aligned. It was damning. Wolfe read too, then leaned back and murmured, "Ingenious." "Real?" I asked. He shook his head, forged, cleverly. "The tone is too stylized, the diction too curated. No man fearing for his life writes like this." These were composed by someone with hindsight and motive. Motive to frame her? Or to extract something, he said. But yes, these were created to be found. I folded the letters gently, as if they might still carry heat. Wolfe said nothing more, but he reached for the wine, and I, watching him, began to wonder whether we were circling a lie made so well that even the dead had started to believe it. It was late afternoon when Captain Orsi returned, bringing with him the particular air of a man who had made a decision and disliked every part of it. He stood in the doorway of Wolfe's suite, rigid, his hat still in his hand, as if he'd forgotten whether to wear it or throw it. "The investigation," he said crisply, "is closed." Wolfe didn't rise. "On whose authority?" "My own." Wolfe inclined his head with an elegance bordering on parody. "Ah, then I shall consider it unofficially irrelevant?" "I insist you return to New York. Your presence here complicates the matter." "It is the matter that is complicated," Wolfe replied. "Not my presence." Orsi's mouth thinned. "There is no evidence, no crime." Wolfe gestured toward the wine. "Come to dinner." Orsi blinked. "Dinner? A meal, a conversation, perhaps a clarification." There was a pause, not quite hesitation, more a calculation of risk versus protocol. "Very well," Orsi said. He accepted the invitation with the expression of a man about to walk willingly into a well-furnished trap, then turned to me. "Does he always eat like this?" "Only when he wants something," I said, "or when he doesn't." If I ever write a book called Murderers I've Dined With, Captain Orsi will get a chapter for posture alone. He sat across from Wolfe like a man bracing for an ambush at the salad course. Unfortunately for him, Wolfe waited until the duck arrived before loading the first volley. "The flaw in your thesis," Wolfe began, "is not that it presumes guilt, it's that it presumes linearity." Orsi frowned. "The man had documents. He disappeared. The documents were real." Wolfe scoffed. "Number? They were manufactured, clumsy in tone, persuasive in structure. Intended not to inform but to incite." "The watch was pawned," Orsi countered. "By a member of the household. That is motive." "It is also misdirection," Wolfe said. Rinaldi was the conduit, not the author. He held what he did not understand. The duck, fragrant with rosemary and wine, was doing its best to distract me. Wolfe ignored it entirely, slicing through logic with more appetite than he ever showed for poultry. Whoever forged the letters intended them to be discovered, not by accident, but by design. Cray, or the man posing as him, grew uneasy. He moved, and for that he was erased. Orsi, now visibly sweating, dabbed at his mouth with a napkin. "You're speculating." "I'm correcting," Wolfe said. "You should try it." Silence followed, except for the clink of Orsi's fork. And for the first time since we landed in Rome, I saw in Wolfe's eyes the faint gleam of advantage, the kind he never acknowledged but always acted on. It was nearly midnight when the call came, not from the front desk but from the Carabinieri station near Trastevere, where the less elegant side of Rome handled its confessions. Elena, the housemaid, with the smile that suggested practiced innocence, had been arrested. The charge? Fencing a gold pocket watch. The victim? Luca Rinaldi, the archivist who'd gone from documents to drowned. She claimed she didn't know it was his, claimed she'd found it under Cray's bed while sweeping. Claimed a lot, apparently, and very prettily. I relayed all this to Wolfe, who was at his desk, rereading the forged letters with the precision of a man deciphering a manuscript. "A watch," he repeated. "In the butler's room?" "Apparently." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Too clean, too late, too well placed." "You think she planted it?" "I think it was planted for her to find, and she performed on cue." I leaned against the desk. "Which means someone wants the narrative back on track." Wolfe folded the letter in his hand. "Then it is time we write a different one." He rose, which was never casual, and moved toward the bedroom. Whatever tomorrow brought, Wolfe intended to meet it already composed. The British Library in Rome was less a library than a mausoleum for paper with good manners. Still, it had the kind of dust that attracts footnotes. And that's where I found the issue. The Tatler, dated May 3rd, 1948, featuring a garden party in Surrey with more monocles than smiles. In the lower left corner, half-shadowed and meticulously postured, stood a young man in butler's livery, Arthur Cray, or rather the real Arthur Cray. He was sharp-featured, narrow-shouldered, with ears like punctuation marks and a gaze that had never once wavered from his professional responsibilities. I stared at it for a full minute, then flipped to the credits. Confirmed, A.H. Cray, in service to the Dowager Lady Sheringham, second from right. The man in that photo was not the one who served aperitifs to the Contessa. Not even close. Which meant the ghost we were chasing, the one with the forged letters, the safety deposit box, and the well-timed disappearance, was wearing someone else's past like a borrowed tuxedo. And the real Cray? He'd left the party 6 years ago, in a London obituary. Back at the hotel, I didn't bother with preamble. I set the photo on Wolfe's table and stepped back like I'd just lit a fuse on an unusually elegant stick of dynamite. He was midway through a glass of Barbara. He glanced down once, then shifted his eyes up to me. "Interesting," he said. Now, in normal conversation, interesting is a placeholder. In Wolfe's mouth, it means the curtain has risen, the audience is seated, and the first act is about to begin. He picked up the clipping, inspected the face without comment, and then laid it beside the forged letters. "His name?" he asked. "Arthur Cray, real one. Died in London, kidney failure, nothing dramatic." He nodded once. "But not the man at the villa. Not even in the same tax bracket." Wolfe tapped the edge of the photo gently. "Then we must consider who benefits from a ghost." And just like that, the game changed shape. It took me less than an hour to get confirmation from the British Home Office, and I only had to impersonate one minor solicitor. Wolfe would have scolded me, except he was too pleased with the result. "Arthur Henry Cray," I read from the telegram, "British citizen, born 1909, deceased 1949, buried in Kensington, survived by no immediate family, death registered with full documentation." Wolfe closed his eyes and let the silence soak in. "So," I said. "We've got a man who died 6 years ago, and another wearing his name like a comfortable coat." Wolfe nodded. "And yet no one noticed." "People notice butlers about as much as light switches. You assume they work unless something flickers." "Apt." He opened his eyes again. "This impostor chose the name carefully, not a stranger's, a dead man's, less risk of contradiction." I asked, "So what was he hiding from?" Wolfe reached for the glass. Or what was he trying to get close to? It was a chilling question, spoken lightly, but it gave me the sense we weren't just dealing with a fake identity. We were dealing with someone who had made lying a structural part of his survival. Wolfe remained quiet for longer than usual, which is saying something. He had that look. The one that means he's finished laying out the chessboard and begun whispering to the pieces. "He did not assume the name arbitrarily," Wolfe said finally. "Arthur Cray had no surviving kin, no legal complexities. His death was quiet, official, and above suspicion." "Perfect mask," I said. "But why?" "There are 2 reasons a man becomes someone else," Wolfe said. "To escape, or to infiltrate." I leaned back. "So either he was running from a past, or towards something worse." "Indeed." "But why a butler?" I asked. "Why not a diplomat or a banker?" Wolfe's mouth curved in the faintest smile. "Proximity. A butler is the invisible man with a key to every locked drawer. To live beside secrets without owning them is the safest position for a thief or a spy." He tapped the photograph. "This man didn't disappear. He never existed." I stared at the forged letters on the table and felt the room constrict just slightly. Whoever this was, he hadn't just borrowed Cray's name, he'd weaponized it. Captain Orsi arrived that evening with a folder and a look that had been marinated in reluctant respect. He sat across from Wolfe, opened the file, and spoke with less edge than usual. "During the war," he said, "a British soldier vanished in Rome. Intelligence Unit MY6. Name was Herbert Bolton. He was supposed to rendezvous with a resistance contact. Never showed. Presumed captured. Or worse." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "And?" "Someone filed a second report in 1950. Anonymous. Claimed Bolton had survived, changed his name, and remained in Italy." "And this came to your desk when?" "Today," Orsi admitted. I could have smiled, but Wolfe got there first, not with his mouth, but with a glint behind the eyelids. "You suspect Cray is Bolton?" "I suspect," Orsi said carefully, "that someone with his training and guilt would need a quiet job, an erased history, and a way to monitor the past without being seen." Wolfe nodded, satisfied. "Then, Captain," he said, "we are finally discussing a man who deserved to disappear." And just like that, the picture sharpened. What had been a vanished butler was now something heavier, a man forged from silence, secrets, and war. It was near midnight when the call came from the villa, the kind that doesn't bother with pleasantries. The deaf chef Pietro had been found dead in his bed, no marks, no signs of struggle, just a pillow out of place, a still body, and a room that smelled of yesterday's rosemary and something more final. I passed the news to Wolfe, who had already risen in his fashion, which meant half an inch straighter in his chair and a line deeper between his brows. "He heard something," Wolfe said. "Not likely," I replied. "He was deaf." "All the more reason he saw something," Wolfe said. "And someone feared what silence might preserve." We didn't speak for a moment. The air in the room felt different, not heavier, just more aware of itself. 3 deaths. 1 forged identity. A villa with history too long for its foundations. Wolfe said, "It has begun. Someone is closing doors before we find which one is unlocked." He looked at me then, sharp and unblinking. "You will return to the villa tomorrow." I nodded, because wherever the scream had been stifled, it hadn't vanished. It was waiting, just behind the last door. If you've never been dispatched to a Benedictine monastery on the outskirts of Rome with nothing but a surname and Wolfe's unspoken expectation of enlightenment, consider yourself fortunate. Santa Cecilia stood on a hill that felt centuries too high and 2 conversations too quiet. Even the gravel on the path seemed apologetic. I was shown to the scriptorium by a novice who treated my shoes like they were auditioning for damnation. There, amid parchment and dust, I found Brother Matteo, a broad-shouldered monk with calloused fingers and a voice like olive oil poured over old stone. "Yes," he said when I asked about Arthur Cray. "He was called Mr. Benson here. English. Polite." He worked in silence. "Friends? No. Curiosities?" Matteo hesitated. He once inquired about a particular manuscript, a sealed confession from the war years, donated by a dying soldier, not to be opened. Why? It was restricted and now it's gone. I didn't ask who might have taken it. Monasteries aren't built for confrontation. But I left with the distinct sense that Cray, or whoever he was, hadn't been binding books. He'd been unbinding something older, and someone else had noticed. Matteo wasn't one to embellish, but when he described Cray, or Mr. Benson as he'd called himself, there was a tone beneath the Latin reserve, a kind of disquiet that monks usually reserve for heresy or tax audits. He asked about the confession 3 times, he said. Once when he arrived, once in Lent, and once last month. Did he say why? Matteo shook his head. He said he was researching genealogy, but it was clear he wanted more. I asked how many others had ever inquired. None, he said. Most volunteers care only about ink and silence. He cared about something that frightened him. He told me the confession had come from a British soldier who died in their hospice, a man who spoke little, wept often, and asked only that the envelope remain sealed for 50 years. And now it's gone, Matteo said quietly. Someone came with purpose. As I walked back down the hill, I had the unpleasant sensation that history, real history, wasn't sleeping behind museum glass. It was awake, restless, and looking for the wrong hands. And one of those hands might have belonged to a butler with a false name and a reason to pray, no one opened the past. Back at the suite, Wolfe sat behind his desk like a man conducting a séance with 3 ghosts and a wine list. I told him everything, the manuscript, the false name, the sealed confession, and the missing envelope that hadn't waited 50 years. He listened with closed eyes, one hand on the armrest, the other turning a pen slowly between 2 fingers. When I finished, he opened his eyes and said, "Then the killer wasn't chasing Cray's silence. He was chasing Cray's memory." I frowned. Not his voice, but what he remembered. Exactly. The envelope was never dangerous unopened, but Cray knew what was inside, or guessed, and he tried to retrieve it. I nodded, slowly, and someone else couldn't risk that. Wolfe sighed, as if some final piece had dropped into place. A man can change his name, his country, even his profession, but not his knowledge. That always follows. Like smoke. He reached for the phone. We returned to the villa. The Contessa didn't weep. She didn't clutch pearls or plead for understanding. She stood in the drawing room, hands folded at her waist, and spoke in the tone of someone offering the final verse to a hymn no one liked. "Yes," she said, "my husband made a list, names of men and women in the resistance. He handed it to the Germans in September of 44, in exchange for a guarantee that our family holdings, the vineyards, the art, the estate, would be left intact." Wolfe said nothing. She continued. He justified it as strategy, preservation. He believed property was eternal and men were momentary. I glanced at Wolfe. His mouth was still, but his fingers pressed together tightly at the tips. "He kept the list," she said, "buried it in the archives. Cray, or the man who called himself that, found something. I don't know what. But I knew the air changed after he did." She turned to Wolfe then. "I'm not innocent of ignorance, Mr. Wolfe, but I am guilty of inheritance." Wolfe nodded once. Not absolution, just acknowledgement. The villa hadn't been haunted by a ghost. It had been haunted by history, waiting, patient, and finally provoked. We remained in the study. I watched her face, not for cracks, but for structure. Grief doesn't always announce itself with salt water and sniffling. Sometimes it's architectural, a stiffness in the neck, a delay between word and breath. "I didn't know," she said. "Not while he lived. He was precise, disciplined. I thought his solitude was noble. It was something else." Wolfe stared at the ceiling. "When did you suspect?" "After his death. There were letters, hints, and Cray was too observant, too still. He knew something." "Did you ask?" I couldn't afford the answer. Wolfe nodded once. "So you hired a man to arrange the household, and accidentally employed the one man who could dismantle its legacy." She didn't deny it. "He read the papers," she said. "Or some of them. I believe he understood what my husband had done, and what it meant." "And what did it mean?" She looked at Wolfe, eyes sharp but hollow. "That the name Farnese would no longer taste like wine. Only ash." Wolfe didn't respond, but I did. It was becoming clear this wasn't just a murder. It was an act of preservation from both sides. The study had been dusted, polished, and emotionally sterilized, but something about the Madonna painting on the far wall caught my eye, and Wolfe's frown. It wasn't the face, which was too smooth, or the colors, which had the faded confidence of old wealth. It was the frame. One corner was brighter than the rest, like it had recently been disturbed or cleaned by someone who didn't know the difference between reverence and curiosity. I stepped closer. The Madonna's smile was too symmetrical, and the thickness of the paint along the lower edge was unnatural, as if something had been covered or concealed. I reached behind the frame. There, tucked between canvas and backing, was a folded piece of paper. Crisp, too clean for the century it was pretending to belong to. I handed it to Wolfe without a word. He unfolded it once, then again. I saw his lips tighten, but not in surprise. Recognition. As if this was a step he had suspected but hoped might remain theoretical. He folded it once, carefully. "Not bad," he said, "but not Roman." I asked, "Then what?" He didn't answer, just said, "It's time." Wolfe sat at the desk, the paper unfolded beside him. The code was basic substitution, likely designed by someone who preferred simplicity to elegance. He read it silently, then aloud. "To H.B., the envelope is hidden, where the angel falls at noon." He folded it precisely, once. Then, looking up at me with the expression he reserves for moves that can't be undone, said, "Prepare the drawing room. I want them all here tomorrow." "Everyone?" I asked. "Yes," Wolfe said. "The gardener, the maid, the Contessa, Orsi." He paused. "And bring chairs. This won't be brief." And I knew the mosaic was almost whole. The drawing room of Villa Farnese was already dramatic without our help. Vaulted ceiling, sunlit tapestries, and furniture that looked better unsat. Wolfe insisted on chairs arranged in a semicircle, like a symposium on guilt. Orsi took the far left without removing his overcoat. Elena crossed her legs twice before settling. Niccolo stood until Wolfe gestured to the last seat, which he took like it was a confession box. The Contessa, dressed in mourning black with no jewelry, sat beside Wolfe, not opposite. That I noticed. Wolfe, ensconced in the largest armchair they had, which still looked like it resented his dimensions, didn't begin with small talk. He rarely does. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you are here not by invitation, but necessity." I stayed in the back, notebook closed, eyes open. "You will listen, you may speak, but I suggest you do the former first." He looked at each of them, not menacing, not warm, just steady, like someone consulting a ledger that hadn't balanced in years. No one moved, and Wolfe, satisfied by the silence, cleared his throat and said, "Let us begin with the butler." Then he folded his hands, and the room held its breath. "The man you knew as Arthur Cray," Wolfe began, "was not. His voice was steady, devoid of flair, the way he spoke when the logic had outpaced his patience. His real name was Herbert Bolton, born in Gloucestershire, 1917, served with British intelligence during the war, disappeared in Rome, 1945, presumed dead. A pause, just long enough for a glance to pass between Orsi and the Contessa. Wolfe continued. Instead of dying, Mr. Bolton chose reinvention. He assumed the identity of Arthur Cray, a butler who had, conveniently, died in London without heirs or headlines. A name, clean and forgettable, ready for use. Wolfe reached for the folded note, the one found behind the Madonna's frame. This, he said, was addressed to H.B., not Cray. A trace left behind by a man who forgot or chose not to erase the truth entirely. Eleanor whispered something, then stopped herself. Orsi sat rigid, as if bracing for a verdict he hadn't requested. Wolfe's eyes flicked to Niccolo. Someone recognized him. Not his name, not his voice, but his history. The past he buried beneath livery and silence. Wolfe leaned forward. Mr. Bolton did not simply vanish, he was removed. The word hung in the air like a dropped curtain. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He just turned slightly toward Niccolo, who had gone still. Not with guilt, but the kind of stillness a soldier learns when the next moment might be measured in bullets. "You knew him," Wolfe said. Niccolo didn't answer. "You knew who he was. Not by name, by presence. You saw the seams in the role, the things he cleaned too well, the things he never touched. You knew what to look for, because you had spent years looking." Niccolo's eyes narrowed. His hands, large and calloused, rested on his knees. "You were with the partisans," Wolfe continued. "You lost family. You fought in the hills outside Rome. You remember the face of the man who directed the arrest of your brothers, the man who wore the same expression the first time you saw him in this villa, pruning vines." The gardener said nothing, but the silence changed shape. "You waited," Wolfe said. "You watched. You intended to expose him. But when he went to retrieve the sealed confession, the document that confirmed what you already knew, you realized waiting was no longer safe." Elena gasped. The Contessa sat frozen. Orsi reached for his pen and missed. "You killed him," Wolfe said quietly. "Not for vengeance, for conclusion." Niccolo's voice, when it came, was almost tender. "He murdered memory. I only gave it rest." Wolfe nodded once, slowly. "Then history, at last, has spoken. And we were no longer in a drawing room. We were in a reckoning." Niccolo didn't bother with denial. Some men confess by silence, some by breathing, and some, like Niccolo, confess by telling the story no one else could know, and speaking it with the weariness of having lived too long with its necessity. "It was raining," he said. Not to us, but to himself. Thunder, the kind that shakes the bones. Bolton, or Herbert Bolton, or whatever name he wore like a borrowed overcoat, had returned to the villa to recover the sealed confession. He'd hidden it decades ago when memory was raw and consequences had yet to hatch. But Niccolo was waiting, not for blood, for silence. "I told him," Niccolo said, "that I would speak." Wolfe, immobile as ever, responded only with a nod, the kind that meant he already knew. Had known, perhaps, since the garden. "And he said he'd stop me." Niccolo's hands rested in his lap, not clenched, not proud. "So I did what war taught us. I covered his mouth. I waited." He was soft. He looked at Wolfe then. "And afterward, I took nothing. Not the note, not the watch, just the silence he tried to keep for himself." No one interrupted. Even Orsi, who had interrupted everything, remained mute. It didn't take prompting for the next piece to fall. Wolfe turned, not with judgment, but with inevitability, and said, "And Rinaldi?" Niccolo exhaled once, like a man stepping into cold water. "The archivist," he said, "had clever eyes and no discretion. He found the forgeries. He laughed when he held them. He thought they were harmless, bad imitations of real crimes. But then, Wolfe said, he understood. Yes, Niccolo replied. He realized they weren't meant to smear her. They were meant to protect her. Wolfe looked faintly pleased. Ah, so they weren't letters of accusation. They were letters of insurance. Niccolo nodded. He threatened to take them to the papers. I asked him not to. He laughed again. And so, Wolfe murmured, he drowned. Accidentally, Niccolo said without irony. The river was there. So was the wine. The rest was timing. And the chef? That, at last, cost him something. He was deaf, Niccolo said, but not blind. He saw Bolton enter the cellar. He saw me leave alone. Silence bloomed again. You didn't want a witness, I said. No, he answered. I didn't want a question. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, as if to preserve the symmetry. When Wolfe turned to the Contessa, it was not with accusation, but with something colder. Detachment wrapped in decorum. He leaned back slightly, as if disassociating from the furniture and the moment, and addressed her like a subject whose testimony had expired. You are not a criminal, he said, by law or deed. But history rarely limits itself to indictments. The Contessa didn't flinch, not visibly. Your husband, Wolfe continued, made a bargain in 1944. He exchanged the names of resistance men, Italians, neighbors, comrades, for the preservation of his cellars and his skin. That choice has fermented in these walls like an unlabeled vintage. You have been breathing it for years. She folded her hands. I did not know. Perhaps not, Wolfe said. But ignorance is not immunity. It merely changes the verdict. Her voice, when it came, was tissue thin. You believe me? I believe, Wolfe said, that belief is irrelevant. You lived with a man who chose comfort over country. Whether you knew, suspected, or chose not to ask, the consequences became yours the day his name carved your gates. There was no objection. None would have mattered. The legacy, Wolfe added, was never wine. It was silence. You inherited both. The Contessa's face remained poised, but in the space behind her eyes, something old collapsed. Wolfe stood, which in our line of work was a gesture heavier than most verdicts. His knees creaked like oaths, but his spine held straight, rigid as a column unshaken by centuries. He looked not at the Contessa, nor at Orsi, who was scribbling now like a man trying to outrun implication. He didn't even look at Niccolo. He looked at the room itself. The frescoes, the parquet floor, the sunlight dying across velvet drapes. There are betrayals, he said, that outlive the dead. His voice was level. He was not performing. There are absences which echo more loudly than guilt, and names that become shadows not because they are forgotten, but because remembering them would poison the soil. No one moved. He shifted his gaze to me, the only man who had carried his bags through all this. Justice, he said, is not always loud. Then, after a moment, but it must be spoken. The silence that followed was not still. It expanded, it coiled, it settled in the chairs and corners and held its breath. And for the first time in days, no one asked what came next, because Wolfe had already answered. We landed at LaGuardia in a fog the colour of cold oatmeal and made it to West 35th without fanfare, bullets, or journalists. Wolfe, swaddled in a camel-hair coat and an expression of divine indifference, didn't so much return as reoccupy. When I unlocked the front door, he waited a full 5 seconds before entering, as though demanding the house reacquaint itself with the weight of his presence. Then he glided, to the elevator, like a man arriving at his own funeral only to declare it premature. He did not greet Fritz, he did not acknowledge me, he did not comment on the 7 days we had spent unravelling a murder wrapped in history and sealed in Latin. He pressed the elevator button, stepped inside, and disappeared upward, with a faint whoosh. I heard the mechanical sigh, then silence. I stood there for a moment, the Roman sunlight still somewhere on my shoulder blades, and realized that for all our travel, for all the wine and betrayal and Vatican ink, Wolfe had returned home with the same number of words he had left it with. None wasted, and none volunteered. I followed up, wondering which Wolfe I'd find. For 3 days he spoke only to Fritz, and then only to critique the beer or request burritos, the latter being the misguided gift of a guest who thought Tex-Mex would broaden Wolfe's cultural sympathies. It did not. The Rome files lay untouched on his desk, sealed like a mausoleum. I gave it a day, then 2. On the 3rd, I asked a question about Rinaldi's ledger, and Wolfe lifted a single finger, not in answer but in elegiac protest, as if to remind me that thoughts were not to be disturbed mid-fermentation. I dined alone, slept half nights, and watched the office fill with shadows more articulate than Wolfe himself. His silence wasn't the sulk of a man wronged. It was the processional quiet of a mind retracing every argument it had ever made with itself, not to revise, but to refine. When he finally took his seat at his desk, Monday, 9:43 a.m., without a word, I took that as a signal, not an invitation, mind you, but a signal, the kind diplomats learn to interpret 3 treaties too late. I cleared my throat. Nothing. Whatever he was digesting, it wasn't burritos. I sat in the office that Tuesday afternoon, feet on the corner of the desk Wolfe never used, flicking through my notes like a gambler reliving a lucky hand. Except the pot had been blood. Herbert Bolton, Arthur Cray, pick a name, lose a life. I'd seen men hide behind aliases before. Some did it for profit, some for protection. Bolton did it for penance, the kind that doesn't ask forgiveness because it knows it won't be granted. The man had buried his past under layers of service and silverware, masquerading as butler, archivist, and remorseful shade. But even ghosts leave footprints, especially the kind that die trying to retrieve confessions they once helped conceal. What stuck with me wasn't the murder. We'd untangled that. It wasn't even the Contessa who carried nobility like a crown dipped in rust. It was the fact that Bolton, for all his false names, never once tried to run when Niccolo cornered him. He faced it. That's the part I couldn't explain or forget. Names can be faked, papers forged, but when a man stays still while history circles like a noose, that's the real identity card. And Bolton punched it with both hands. It took Kramer 4 days to show. That's a record considering our last Roman excursion ended with him hurling an ashtray across the room. This time he brought paper instead of projectiles, a subpoena, official and pompous, and a face like the Fifth Avenue sidewalk at rush hour. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't blink. He sat in his chair like a tree that had already decided where the roots would go, and lifted one thick hand. Kramer didn't flinch. He dropped the paper on Wolfe's desk with a plop worthy of municipal fiction. "You left a corpse in another country," Kramer said. "This is a courtesy. Don't make me escalate it." Wolfe looked at the document, tore it cleanly in half, and dropped both pieces into the wastebasket with the elegance of a man discarding unwanted poetry. "Rome," he murmured, "is out of your jurisdiction, and beyond your understanding." Kramer sputtered, then paused. Something about Wolfe's stillness, or perhaps the fact that I was already opening a bottle of sherry, convinced him to depart without the usual volcanic forecast. The door closed. Wolfe exhaled. "You handled that politely," I said. "I withheld the Latin," Wolfe replied. "It arrived by courier, a square envelope with Italian parchment and a seal I didn't recognize. I turned it over twice before carrying it up to the plant rooms. Fritz intercepted me with the delicacy of a man protecting a ritual. Wolfe was trimming a Paphiopedilum and declined all intrusion, including mine. I waited until lunch. He opened it slowly. Inside was a folded vellum map, the kind that smells of museums and secrets. Inked with obsessive precision, it detailed a segment of Rome's catacombs. A single corridor, barely 2 inches in length, was looped in red. There was no explanation. Just a note, handwritten in the Contessa's slope. for the mind that never forgets. Wolfe stared at it for a long time, not with curiosity, with consideration. He didn't speak, he didn't ask questions, he simply walked it to the safe and tucked it inside, as if it belonged there all along, next to the Montenegrin passport and the only photograph he keeps of his father. When I finally broke the silence and asked what it meant, he shook his head once. "Some maps," he said, "are drawn for memory, not directions." I let it rest. But he didn't. He didn't talk about it. Not once. But orchids don't lie, and neither does Fritz's nose. A week after the map arrived, the rooms began to smell different. Not overwhelming, just drier, sharper. A note under the sweetness. Bitter, piney, ancient. I know because I asked Fritz, and he said, with faint disapproval, "Cypress bark. Roman, not local." I didn't ask where Wolfe got it. Some questions you don't ask if you want to keep the answer from spoiling the wine. He had added it quietly to one corner of the greenhouse, not to replace anything, but to sit beside it. A contrast, a reminder, a single black urn, discreet, nestled in foliage, as though grief had been granted visitation rights but no keys to the estate. For days he didn't mention Bolton, or Niccolo, or the confession that never reached a priest, but when I found him seated among the orchids that Sunday, hands steepled, eyes closed, I knew he wasn't pruning petals. He was pruning conclusions. Some men bury their pasts. Wolfe cultivates his, trims it, waters it, and leaves it under glass where he can study the bloom and the blight side by side. I asked if he wanted tea. "No," he said, "let it be bitter." And I did, because in Wolfe's greenhouse everything grows, even silence. In the quiet that followed Rome, justice wore no badge and carried no gavel, only the weight of memory and the unblinking gaze of a man who refused to forget. Names had changed, allegiances had blurred, but in the end it was truth that slipped through the cracks like evening light in an old villa. Some legacies, no matter how gilded, are rooted in silence too deep to cleanse. Do you believe the killer truly had a choice? Or was he simply the last voice in a room full of buried ghosts? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.